Governor Graham claims to be a Christian, but he won't even talk to me about my son.
May the 22nd, 1979, the evening news on American television.
How can he kill my son?
John Spinkalink's mother in a late afternoon appeal to Florida Governor Bob Graham to spare her son's life. Spinkalink, age 30, killed a man in Tallahassee. He says it was self-defense. Willie Darden, 45, convicted of killing a furniture store owner in Lakeland. He says he didn't do it. Only a cell apart on Florida's death row now, they are among the 521 condemned prisoners awaiting the death penalty in the United States. Their deaths would be the first execution since Gary Gilmore's in 1977, the first in Florida in 15 years.
Everybody has hope back there. I don't think if there'd just be a very few that don't. But I don't think there's anybody on death row now that does want to die.
The drama is being played out in a rural conservative community 20 miles north of Gainesville. This is Stark, known for its speed traps and its prisons. There are 3 within a 10-mile area. The prisons are a major employer and economic force in a community where religion and respect for the law run deep, where feelings about capital punishment run strong.
WAPE, the Big Ape, Jacksonville's best rock.
24 hours before the day set for Spinkalink's execution, families in the Jacksonville area woke up as usual to their favorite disc jockey, the Greaseman. This, believe it or not, is what they heard.
Just about 10 minutes after 6 here at the Big Ape with the Greaseman, ready to begin another action-packed day. Actually, I feel pretty perky because I got some great news yesterday. Yeah, they're going to electrocute them guys. Isn't that wonderful? It's about time we cleared out them maggots on death row. I'll dedicate this morning show to Spankalink and Darden. And I know those guys listen on death row because, geez, they got radios, TVs, they practically got videotape recorders. 15 minutes after 6, here it is, the Spankalink song. Hot stuff! Listen to it, Spanky! Listen! 100,000 watts of juice! That'll get the red out of your eyes. You mean to tell me that the guy could lie there and then just kind of shake his head and go, damn, that was some kind of shock, you know? And then the guy would throw the switch to maximum voltage. And then once again, he could go, and they'd see him still squirming there. They'd get him again, huh? Spinkalink, you maggot! You listening this morning, Spinkalink? Yeah. Just think, yeah. In just over 24 hours, Spinkalink, yeah, you're gonna fry, maggot. You're gonna fry. And them bleeding hearts can't do a thing to save you. Get used to this sound, Spinkalink. Picture yourself convulsing.
John Spinkalink had been sentenced to death for first-degree murder in 1973. But Spinkalink has claimed throughout that he was forced into Russian roulette and sodomy and killed only in self-defense. Had he committed such a murder in Miami, where crimes of this sort are commonplace, he would have faced a charge of second-degree murder which does not carry the death sentence. That is the opinion of state prosecutors here. But it was not in metropolitan Miami that Spinkalink murdered Joseph Simankiewicz. It was in tiny upstate Tallahassee, the state capital, the seat of the legislature, where murder is an event and punished to the letter. When he appeared in court here, Spinkalink was so confident in his plea of self-defense that he rejected a deal from the state which offered him second-degree murder in return for an admission of guilt. It was here that John Spinkalink murdered Joseph Simankiewicz. A third man, one Frank Brum, who shared their room, was charged as an accomplice. But Brum made a deal with the state. As a result, he is now free and Spinkalink faces the electric chair. A local journalist became interested in the anomalies of the case after meeting Spinkelink in the state penitentiary. Wayne Izell spoke to Brum at Spinkelink's suggestion.
No, as a matter of fact, he asked me, he helped me get in touch with Frank Brum, his accomplice in that case, the fellow who had been with him at the motel and actually helped him commit the murder. And he said that Brum could give me information that would show that Spinkelink had done it in self-defense. My agreement with Spinkelink was that I would write whatever I found out. He said, okay. So somehow he got word to Brum to call me, and I had a long conversation with Brum on the telephone. I think I was probably the first reporter ever to talk to Brum since he had been acquitted. And I wrote a story, and that story was based on what Brum said. Of course, Brum said, no, it was first-degree murder. It was murder in cold blood.
This man is the Reverend Tom Feemster. For over 2 years, he's visited men on death row. He formed a particularly close friendship with John Spinkelink, whom he saw every month for several hours on end.
I think when they put John in prison at 25 years old, he was an adult juvenile delinquent. And I think the worst thing that John had going for him was his juvenile record. He didn't have much of a record as far as an adult was concerned. An angry young man, footloose, fancy-free, with a big heart. John was a very kind-hearted person. As a matter of fact, the man that he killed, he picked up in a snowstorm. And he did it out of the kindness of his heart because he didn't want the guy standing on the road hitchhiking in sub-freezing weather. And John had done a lot of work on himself. He had grown a lot in the probably 4 years previous to when I'd seen him, and then a tremendous amount in the 2 years that I spent with him. So I didn't see him as a murderer, a heinous killer, and that sort of thing, no.
Spinkelink has not spent the entire 6 years on death row. In September 1977, he was walked down this corridor to the Death Watch cells after his first death warrant was signed. He got a stay and talked to us about his feelings then.
It caught me off guard. I didn't expect it. I didn't think mine would be the first one signed. After it was signed, though, well, it was just something you had to accept. I had a pretty heavy faith in my attorneys, though. I think I was, well, there was some of the attorneys that represent me now, like Anthony Amsterdam. Now, he's representing death row cases all across the country. And there's different chloration organizations that are helping against the death penalty. And if it wasn't for them people there, they might have went ahead and got away with it, the state of Florida.
But 20 months later, the newly elected Governor Bob Graham fulfilled one of his election pledges.
Whereas John A. Spinkelink did on the 4th day of February 1973 murder Joseph Szymankiewicz, and whereas John A. Spinkelink was found guilty of murder in the first degree and was sentenced to death on the 20th day of December 1973, now therefore I, Bob Graham, as governor of the state of Florida, and pursuant to the authority and responsibility vested by the Constitution and laws of Florida, do hereby issue this warrant directing the superintendent of the Florida State Prison to cause the sentence of death to be executed upon John A. Spinkelink on some day of the week beginning noon, Friday, the 18th of May.
The superintendent of Florida State Penitentiary is David Brierton.
All right, the statute calls for, in Florida, for the governor to sign the warrant and designate a 7-day period. That 7-day period can virtually run from any hour he sets it. Within that time frame, I have to set the hour. And at that point, I personally inform the man and then take any requests he has for phone calls for attorneys. And then, of course, it's a daily process. We have to adjust by virtue of where the legal process is and where his appeals and stays and things are. And, of course, to the man's own desires.
The governor had in fact signed 2 death warrants. The first Spinkelink's, The second on Willie Darden, who got a stay a mere day before the time set for his execution. Darden describes how he and Spinkelink were brought down this corridor to be informed officially that their warrants had been signed.
Before I got down here, which John Spinkler and I was together out in the hall. So when I looked around and...
You both got collected off death row.
At the same time.
And brought here.
Right. So when I looked around and I saw that they would not let any peons escort us down, but lieutenants instead.
Biggest and bad.
I told John Spinkler, then I said, John, I said, this is it. I said, Governor Graham done did one of the tricks on us. And so John told me, he said, well, are you thinking the same thing I'm thinking? I said, yep. I said, don't sign our death warrant. So we came on down here, and John went in that room over there to the far side. I was taken in this room over there where they were sitting down behind him. So they went in and talked with John first. And then after talk with John, he came and told me that the superintendent came and told me that the Governor Graham had signed my death warrant.
What about John? How did you take it?
Well, I didn't see John when they was talking to him, but I assure you that he took it calmly because we was on the same tier as when they took us back. See,
they took you downstairs to...
They took us back to Q Wing after we left from up here.
Q Wing is the block on the right. It houses the electric chair. Condemned men brought from the adjacent death row spend their last days in the death watch cells behind this green door. Through it, the two executioners will pass into the death chamber on the appointed day, Wednesday, May the 23rd.
Across the road from death row, in a cow pasture filled with Winnebagos, people came from around the country to plead Spinkelink's case. Former Attorney General Ramsey Clark, Amnesty International, the ACLU. The appeals have been exhausted. The chances of a last-minute stay seemed remote. But Lois Spinkelink, the condemned man's mother, refused to give up.
I'm prepared for anything, but I hope that there'll be a Christian enough that can stay this execution. And what I ask of my son, I ask for every other boy that's on death row.
Well, John had been dealing with death and life, God, who he was, a long time. And I don't think John was afraid to die. I think John was beyond dying in the electric chair. He was frightened, naturally. Any human being would be. I would certainly be frightened if they were going to put me in an electric chair. But I thought John was had collected himself very well and was dealing with issues. You know, this is insanity. Why are we doing this? You know, and John was really more concerned with his mother and me, Carlotta, David Kendall, his lawyer, about the kinds of things we were going through than what he was going through.
What was to have been a vigil for John Spinkelink turned into a celebration at about 1 o'clock when word came that federal judge Elbert Tuttle in Atlanta and Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall had delayed the execution until at least tomorrow, perhaps Friday.
I feel fantastic. Any time is worth something.
In just 24 hours?
Even 24 hours. It's a little bit more time for him.
Spinkelink found out about his latest reprieve a few minutes after the people outside the prison did. His minister, Tom Feimster, was with him when the news flashed across a television screen.
He looked at it and sort of things relaxed. Really a great time.
What did he say when he first heard about it?
Thank God.
The first execution time was at 7 o'clock on Wednesday morning, the 23rd. And so I was with John from about 10:30 Tuesday evening until about 1:30 Wednesday morning when he got to stay. And this was the first opportunity that I had to be with John at his cell. So we got up there about 10:30 and of course just it's a three-celled sort of a aisle there. The inmates were chanting free Spinkelink, burning mattresses, beating on their cots, and three guards I was sitting in the proximity of, well, there were just maybe 2 feet between me and 3 guards, and then John was over here. We didn't really have much privacy, but we were able to talk. John wanted to take communion, and the warden had allowed that I may stay there until around 3 o'clock. So we had set a time of maybe 2:45, 2:30 that we would go through the communion process and that sort of thing. Well, there was a television set right behind us. And as we were talking, one of the guards said to John, "Hey, John, look at this." And when he said that, I turned around and looked at the bottom of the television screen, and on typograph or whatever it is, went across the bottom that a stay of execution has been granted. I thought they were talking about Willie Darden, because Darden had just been had just granted a stay that day. But then I saw John Spinkalink's name, and I was quite elated. You know, I said, "John, you know, hey man, you know, it's happened. We got to stay." And John said, "Yeah, I know, but it's a temporary kind of a thing. And look what we're putting our people through, just for a temporary stay." So John didn't really see that stay as something that was going to last.
At the Capitol building in Tallahassee, lawyers for the state of Florida worked all next day and into the following night to vacate the stay. In other words, to reverse Judge Tuttle's temporary reprieve. At 11:30 p.m. on Thursday, May the 24th, the court ruled for death.
In the early morning hours following the court's decision, the activity started picking up at Florida State Prison. There was a feeling that the machinery had been put in motion, that by 10 o'clock in the morning, the time chosen by the prison superintendent, John Spinkalink would be strapped into the electric chair.
Was this a hard decision for you to make?
Of course it's a hard decision. Anytime there's a human
Do you
life
foresee any problems in being ready by 10 o'clock? Do you see any delays?
We'll be ready. I start from the hypothesis that the duty of the superintendent of Florida State Prison is to, by the will of the legislature and at the disposal of the judiciary, is to carry out the law as it's intended. Now, what we did actually was not a hasty decision. Obviously, we knew the night before that Judge Tuttle was going to vacate the stay at 9:30, so we set it a half hour from that point. So it was not a situation that would mean that we were attempting to rush to do this thing. I think we carried out the will of the legislature.
By daybreak, things started happening quickly. The number of protesters grew as it became clear to most everyone here that Spinkalink did not have much of a chance. Final preparations for the execution were underway. There were 2.5 hours left in John Spinkalink's life, and his sister was still insisting he was innocent of premeditated murder in the killing of Joseph Smankowitz.
Johnny has never denied killing this fella, but he killed the guy in self-defense.
As the time drew nearer, protesters concentrated their efforts on the Capitol building. Inside, the situation was growing uglier.
Chanting and shouting, an estimated 500 demonstrators took over the governor's outer office shortly after 9 a.m. Pounding on the walls and the receptionist's desk, the crowd wanted to speak to Bob Graham. A security agent escorted the receptionist to safety, and sheriff's deputies were brought in to keep the crowd from storming the governor's inner office. The group then took over the phone bank, urging all of the incoming callers to help stop the execution. With that action, the governor's legal counsel came out of the inner office, asking to no avail that the phones be kept open for communication with the courts and the prison.
You and the governor could stop it, and you're not trying to stop it. It's from you. From you.
John was visibly more nervous than he had been in the past. He smoked more cigarettes. I think he felt like that he vacillated between saying, I don't think it's going to happen, and then if it does, I hope something good comes from this insanity. And those were his words. I hope something good comes from this insanity. And then on Friday morning, he said again, I want you to witness my execution. And he said, if it comes off. And because John didn't think it was really coming off up until the last moment, he still had hope. And I said, John, again, I'm not sure that I can handle that. You know, we're friends, and I have a very difficult time seeing this thing. He said, Tom, if I can prepare myself to go in and sit in that chair, I'd like to be able to look out through that glass and see someone who I cared about and who cared about me, rather than a bunch of people gawking at me. And I had to say, okay, I'll do it. And so I agreed to do it. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do.
According to the laws of Florida, 12 official witnesses shall be present at an electrocution. Provision is also made for a limited number of pressmen. No cameras or tape recorders are allowed.
They began arriving at the Bradford County Courthouse around 8 a.m., dressed in business suits. State legislators, a criminology professor, a small-town newspaper publisher, nearly all of them strong proponents of capital punishment. More than 100 people had applied to witness this execution, but they had been picked. They said they regarded it as an educational experience, but no one much cared to talk about it in detail.
But 4 witnesses talked to us. There was the newspaperman Wayne Ezell, a television reporter Ed Hooler, and as well as Tom Feimster, there was one of the official witnesses, Tommy Green, proprietor of 4 small newspapers.
Several years ago, I had requested to be a state witness for the next execution, when and if it ever came about. And I did this because I wanted a kind of an insight on how things were being taken. It gives me a kind of like a further education on capital punishment. The crimes that are committed that warrant the death penalty, I think, should through all expediency, go ahead and have the punishment carried out.
You're outrightly in favor of it?
Yes, sir.
Now, some people might say it's a sort of ghoulish thing to do, to want to watch a man be executed. Did you feel that way about it at all?
No, sir, I didn't.
Did you have any feelings about the man? Did you feel sorry for him at all in that situation?
I'm sorry that his life was the way it was. The rest of the world would be a lot better off if people didn't have to go through this. He started off when he was 13 years old in trouble. I feel sorry for his mother. I felt sorry for the fact that he had created the life that he had created. I felt sorry for the victim and their family.
They piled into a Dodge van, and by the time they pulled into the prison, there were about 100 protesters outside, separated from correction officers by a wire fence. At 9:30 a.m., the stay of execution imposed by the U.S. District Court of Appeals in New Orleans on Wednesday expired. The final roadblock had been removed, and the state of Florida was free to execute John Spinkelink.
It was just shortly before 10 o'clock when we entered the room there, I believe. The blinds were drawn in the room. I was, I think, a little surprised to not find the room as dreary or as cold as I thought it might be for the mission that it was to be carried out. It had apparently been freshly painted, had a soft orange glow to the walls, no damp, musky smell like you might expect from such a dungeon-esque maybe atmosphere. But the room was very quiet. Everyone seemed real settled, no great tenseness in the air. I didn't detect any real tension.
The witness room, the only thing in front of us at the time were these glass windows, 4 glass windows. It was almost like a picture glass window, but there was some separation. And then there were the Venetian blinds that were in front of us. So that's all we saw, and it was sort of like one fellow described it as like sitting in a doctor's office without any music. Nobody really said anything. It wasn't something you didn't really know how to act. So we sort of sat around looking at each other and being rather silent.
I could see from my seat, I could see through a small crack in the blinds, and that's, I guess, perhaps why I picked that seat where I did and didn't move over 1 or 2 spaces. I could see a thin slice of the chair through the crack in the blinds. It was a little after 10 o'clock that I did see more movement, and after the view from the blinds being blocked by someone standing in front, John Spinkelink sitting in the electric chair. I could see his white shirt and a soft gleam from the top of his head, which was cleanly shaved.
I was sitting on the front row, and myself and one or two others were able to see through the blinds. And we saw when they brought him in, and when they set him down and buckled him into the chair, there was no fighting, there was no squirming, there was no conversation. It was all done very professional, brought in, and the procedures was carried out as stated by law.
That view was once again opened up to me when the cap and the cable that is attached to the death cap and placed atop the condemned man's head was affixed to Spinkelink. The man that was performing the work was standing behind Spinkelink, and I could see just his hands holding the cap and adjusting it over his head, and finally then securing it. The next step was for the cable. Thick cable, must have been just about an inch thick, I imagine, was placed right over the bolt on top of the head. And I could see the hand slowly twisting down the large nut over the bolt. And it's a close fit between that nut and bolt. It took about 30 seconds of very slow hand twisting to get the bolt, the nut all the way down to the end of the bolt to get the cable secured.
It was about 10:05, and I thought, okay, now it's going to happen. But it didn't. So I began to become uneasy. And the window, the door to the left of the large window that you would view the execution had small cubicles, and they were beginning to cover those up with paper so you couldn't see through the door. The Venetian blind was down so that you couldn't see, and we could hear commotion going on inside. And when I say commotion, I don't mean rowdy commotion, just we could hear noises. They were preparing John. This was the most difficult part because I could visualize in my mind this friend of mine, John Spinkelink, with his head shaved, the inhumanity and lack of dignity of doing this to a human being, marching him handcuffed into this room and putting him in a chair, strapping his arms in, and in effect saying, we really don't care about you. You know, you're human, but we don't care. I had a very difficult time with that because, you know, there were people that did care. So I began to read the 5th chapter of Matthew, our Lord's Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor, and this sort of thing, and because that was one of the things that John and I used to talk about quite a bit. And David Kendall, John, who was very close to John, and his attorney, was trying to memorize and trying to remember the 23rd Psalm, and he occupied his time doing that. And so then all of a sudden the Venetian blind came up, and here was John. And I think at that time is when it became easier for me, because at that time I began to realize the state had been cheated, that they weren't really killing the John Spinkelink that they wanted to kill. They'd been cheated because John Spinkelink had already dealt with his death. And this job that they were doing, this electrocution, well, they were not killing John Spinkelink. The John Spinkelink that they wanted to kill died several years ago. They were killing a human being who was in touch with life. Excuse me.
The blinds were up for 30 seconds. Spinkelink was sitting there like this, and he was looking forward, and he looked a little bit to the left and to the right with his eyes, just flipped his eyes about some. He did not seem, there seemed to be an unusual expression, but no real expression that you could describe. One witness said there was terror in his eyes. I had seen his eyes before. I could not say that there was terror. It was a nondescript kind of look on his face, or in his eyes.
with this terrible look of fear in his eyes. His eyes seemed bleary, bloodshot. They were wide open, very much like a scared animal. Very much so. There was a tremendous look of terror in his face. But that's all. That is all the expression. That is all the statement that we as witnesses got out of him.
He was strapped in with 9 straps. There was one around each leg. There was one here and then one here, one across here, one a seat belt type. And there was something like a chin strap on a football helmet that came across his mouth and his chin right in here. He looked at us and looked at him for 15 to 20 seconds. This was so that it would know that, in fact, he was Mr. Spinklink, as witnesses. The gentleman, if you'd like, I can show you here on here. The gentleman, this gentleman here walked forward and pulled either leather or rubber blind down over his face. He stepped back and nodded to the executioners, which had black hoods on their faces. He nodded to them, and at that moment, Mr. Spinklink gripped both hands tight, and there was no other movement. This happened at 10:13.
When the surge of power came, the body lurched in a very rapid surge of tension, just a very, very taut and straining. And it held that position, or seemed to hold that position, and never stopped that straining. Even when it was over, the straining continued. Some said they heard a thwacking sound. I heard nothing. It was, you were sitting there looking at the body, and all of a sudden the body goes into this straining, and it seems to hold that straining. And then after the power surge came, there was the thrust, but this hand remained the same with these 2 fingers together, and the skin began to turn bluish, reddish color, and the right fist never moved, but this hand slowly turned over like this during the 6 minutes, or I guess the first 2 minutes. It turned over very slowly.
There was no flailing about. It was a very subtle execution. People in the front row said that they could see some smoke. They could see his skin sizzle. But from our vantage point, I could not see a great deal of physical reaction from John Spinklink.
At 10:15, he nodded to the gentleman back here. This gentleman leaned down and unplugged the power cords from the power unit back here. He then nodded to this gentleman over here, who walked over, unbuckled the chest strap, undid his buttons, pulled his T-shirt up. Apparently the physician and the doctor, came over and checked his heart.
Then he stepped back and nodded some indication to Briarton, the superintendent. The superintendent, who was in charge of all this, turned pale for some reason. I never understood why, but he turned very white, or palish color. And they waited a moment. And then the doctor came and stepped up again and put the stethoscope to the heart. Listened a moment, turned to the superintendent and shook his head again. And some of us thought, my God, he's not dead yet.
I stood up about 10:16, half stood up to get a better view of the death chamber. And I could see his right pant leg rolled up to about the knee level. And along his shin, a wound about 8 inches or so opened up. It was not a profusely bleeding wound. It was just a red line running down the center of his shin that the electrical current had opened up.
And then the doctor came back the third time and checked the heart with a stethoscope again and checked the pulse this time. And then he pulled a pen light from his pocket, lifted the mask that was over the veil that was over the face, and shined it into the light, into the eye to check for death. And then he lifted the other side and shined it into that eye. At that moment, I could see Spinkalink's face. It was a bluish. It had turned much darker, bluer, and it had a deathly pall to it, and it looked. It was a little shiny, maybe perspiration or something. I'm not sure, but it was a deathly looking face. And then the doctor turned to Brierton, the superintendent. He gave him a motion with his head. Superintendent gave some signal, I suppose, with his hands. And the Venetian blinds fell, and that was it.
The man never knew. He knew what was going to hit him, but he didn't know when it hit him. It was over with. It's being like being hit on the top of the head with a bolt of lightning. You don't hear the thunder. He didn't hear the switch fall.
You felt that watching it?
Yes, sir. There was the ones that are opposed to capital punishment. They had all the particulars about how the body would burn and smoke and bleed and etc. None of this happened. He tightened his fist one time and it was over with. He was unaware from the instant the switch was pulled of what happened.
You were right in the front, so you could see?
I was within 6 to 7 feet of him.
After the execution was over, and everyone was sitting there very quietly, the curtain, the Venetian blind went down, I began to think, you know, my God, if this is not just and merciful punishment, you know, if we're wrong, we had better pray to God to have mercy on us. And so that's what I said. I said to those people, I said, if this is not just and merciful punishment, we need to pray to God to have mercy on our souls.
Shortly after the execution, a squad of correction officials lined up in front of the prison. A police helicopter hovered overhead as members of Spinkalink's defense team finally broke down at the realization that their client was dead. After 12 long years, the United States today resumed the practice of involuntary executions. The debate over capital punishment, whether it's justice or revenge, will continue on the streets, in coffee shops, and in the courts. The waiting and the uncertainty is over for John Spinkalink, but not for 132 other convicted murderers still on death row. Steve Croft, Newswatch 10 at the Florida State Prison in Stark.
The man had on a nice clean white shirt, nice clean blue trousers. As I say, what we saw was only 7 minutes long, and it was clinical. There was no question that it had been managed. Furthermore, the rules say, the state law says that the man is allowed to have a last statement, that the man is allowed to, I think, to see the press. Spinkalink asked to see the press asked to see Spinkalink. The prison authorities said no.
He was not able to make a last statement had he so wished. Why was that?
All right. At that point, his last statement had already been made. He elected at this one to give his last statement through his minister. Now, there was a question because of the straps and things that he could not make a last statement. We're going to make sure that that issue isn't raised again, because it was certainly it was controversial to the extent that some people even went so far as to accuse us of gagging the man, which is absurd. The man elected to make his last statement through his minister. Now, possibly the next one will not. So we will have the process to the point where he can make his last statement in the most dignified manner he can.
But since Superintendent Brierton spoke to us, there's been an official inquiry. He's testified on oath that when Spinkalink was strapped into the chair, he was asked whether he had a final statement. Through his mouth strap, he said indistinctly, "I can't speak." This Brierton took to be Spinkalink's final statement.
Did you find it a kind of an unforgettable experience that you feel will harrow you? It is your first one, after all.
That's correct. No, I I found it, as I said, I found it sad. When I came here, I knew that the possibility would exist. And within that parameter, I think you get yourself ready for something like this on an incremental basis. I don't think it's an either-or proposition. I think that as time goes on and you see that the possibility exists, you have to make a decision that that you will or will not partake.
Who decides how much of the process, how much of the execution the official witnesses will see?
I do. Well, I do within the parameters of the law. The law says that the execution will take place and that the people here will do it. That's really what we tried to fulfill.
We've spoken to one or two, I think is probably the word that was most often used. Is that the kind of response that you were after, that you wanted? An efficient clinical operation?
Well, clinical is not my term, it's theirs, and whether it may be universal to the people you spoke to. What we wanted was to fulfill the law in the most, very difficult to describe the process of taking one's life. I wouldn't want to say business-like, but we wanted a neutral, we were functionaries, nothing more, nothing less.
I didn't find it very clinical or very cold, and I don't know how we can possibly think of it in that vein. We're talking about a child of God who is being killed, put to death right before our eyes. John, as a matter of fact, had asked that the governor be there, the superintendent of prisons be there, and all of those people who were really wanted to see, or were proponents of the death penalty, let them come and watch how barbarous this thing is. They tried to make it as clinical as they could. They tried to cover it up. As a matter of fact, in Texas, I believe it is, they put a syringe or a needle in a person's arm and run 6 syringes away from it so they won't know who's shooting the lethal dose. They're trying to make it a clinical thing, and we're not going to be able to do that. No.
As we sit here this very day, the governor has signed 2 more death warrants. Do you think it's the beginning of a flood of executions?
Yes, I do. I think that the governor is ready to sign death warrants, and I think the state is, the superintendent is ready to carry them out. And I think that the opposition to the death penalty, it's growing. It's just not growing fast enough. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to save those people who are going to go down now, and there are going to be some. But I see this conscientizing this country, that we're not going to get rid of our problems by killing people. And it's horrendous for me to think that we think we can solve a problem taking a human life. It's beyond my comprehension as a human being and as a priest.